So yeah, hey guys, we just had Thomas Jay Oord.
He was awesome.
Yes, on the podcast. He was awesome.
He wrote a book called God Can't. The subheading here says, How to Believe in a God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Evils.
Yeah.
He really deals with the question of evil.
Yep.
And a good and loving God.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It makes a statement, a God who causes or allows evil is not someone we can trust.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
So we dove into some themes like, did God cause that?
Right.
Did he allow it to happen?
Yeah, and he writes about the sovereignty of God. He actually has another book called The Uncontrolling Love of God, which is when I was first introduced to him. But that's focused on the nature of God, the sovereignty of God, free will, and foundationally he always comes down to love, which of course is why he's on the podcast.
100%. That's it.
That's it right there. Yeah, the goodness of God and the love of God being the central theme of everything he writes. In fact, he said at the end, he's working on a new book, and his wife said another one on love, something to that extent. But
which is all I teach on.
that's right. That's the only message.
I got one message. It just takes 100 different variations.
That's the message.
That's the message.
That's all I'm ever saying.
In this particular interview, Thomas brought out his love for Jesus' statement that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And that the good life, the abundant life, is found when we find a loving God.
Yeah, that's good. You guys are really going to be blessed by this podcast. Thanks for coming on the journey with us. We can probably just dive in here. Really grateful to have you. I'll just tell you a little bit. I only got to know you a few years ago. Somebody introduced me to your book because of the title of my book was God is Out of Control. The whole story is better than you think. And then, you know, your book, God Can't, The Uncontrolling Love of God. I was actually jealous. I was like, The Uncontrolling Love of God. That should have been the title. It's so good.
I love it.
And so I've been following you ever since, and would love to have you share a little bit about yourself, maybe some of your journey, and then we want to dive into this book with you.
Yeah, we want to definitely introduce our audience to you and your voice. So tell us all about yourself.
Super. Well, thanks again for the opportunity for this chat. I grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical community. My parents were faithful Christians. I spent a lot of time in church. I like to say I gave my heart to Jesus many times as a kid. In high school and college, I took my faith very seriously. I was one of those people who was, pestering folks about religion and doing street witnessing and bar witnessing. I was a part of Campus Crusades for Christ. And then about my senior year of college, I took a course in philosophy of religion. For the first time, really took seriously the arguments of folks from other religious traditions, for atheists, agnostics, and decided that the reasons I had for believing that there was a God at all weren't all that strong. And so I'll never forget coming to pick up my fiance, who's now my wife, her getting into the car, and here we are, senior year in college, and me telling her that I can't believe in God anymore.
Wow.
I was an atheist / agnostic for intellectual reasons. Some people are atheists for other reasons. And for me, that meant continuing the quest to try to make sense of things. And I eventually came to believe in God again, or think it was more plausible than not that there's a God. And that kind of return to faith was based primarily on two things. One, I wanted to believe that life had ultimate meaning, and I couldn't make sense of it unless there was some ground for that meaning that most people call God.
Yeah.
And secondly, I had these really deep intuitions that I ought to be a loving person, that other people ought to be loving, that in some way love was the answer.
Yeah.
And I couldn't make good sense of that intuition if there wasn't some source for love that, again, most people call God. So for a while, my theology was pretty thin. I believed there was a God of love, and Jesus is pretty cool, and that was about it. And in fact, I lost a job early on as an associate pastor because I didn't have the right Christology. But I, over time, have developed more of a theology that's a little thicker than that, but it's still based fundamentally in the claims of God's love.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm willing to rethink lots of other ideas so long as I continue to keep love at the center.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That is really what Jason and I have put as our foundation. You know, Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And we take that statement that God is love, period, and put a period at the end of it. And if that's the case, then I need to reconcile my view of God around the person of Jesus and the character and nature that I see him exhibiting. And that's what's caused us to rethink God in many ways. You have a quote on the back of your book that absolutely, I think, sets this conversation in order. And it's, a God who causes or allows evil is not someone we can trust. That's just putting it out there. And I have had that own epiphany myself. Jason has as well, where, you know, why would I trust a God that is the cause and source of evil? You know, the theology that's shaped around suffering, that God causes it to, say, teach a lesson, or to, you know, because he's in control.
Right. And because that's what we've been taught. And I would guess, as you said, for intellectual reasons, why one of the reasons that you probably could no longer believe in God. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. You know, I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, which is a little denomination that's a part of the Wesleyan tradition. And so we believed in free will. That was a big thing for us.
Yeah.
And so when it came to evil, you know, I would say, well, you know, don't blame God for that torture or that rape. People are using their free will wrongly. But then I would say, God is allowing it to happen.
Right.
And I thought to myself, hold on a second. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like,
no.
Would I be a loving parent if I allowed my kids to torture and abuse each other, and if I could stop them? Yeah. And of course I wouldn't. And so that began to push me to think about God's power in a different kind of way, so that I could say that God not only doesn't cause evil, but also doesn't permit it or allow it, as if God could have stopped it.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. There's so much clarity that comes. As I said, I've used the term relational theologian. For me, if you can't figure it out in the context of love, in the context of a relationship, then it's too much for me. I can't. It's probably not true. And it's, for me, I find often when I can understand God as a father, all of a sudden everything else starts to fall in order. But it's that compromise. I could never seem to make that compromise. What kind of good and loving father would allow this kind of evil, which of course comes from the idea that God is in control, right?
Yep. Either in control or could be in control if God really cared enough to, just step in and intervene and fix things.
Yeah.
But if God can do that occasionally, then you wonder why God doesn't do that a whole lot more often to fix the horrible things that occur in our lives.
Which is then a paralysis of distrust. My passion is intimacy. You can't have intimacy without trust. And if he isn't always good, then you can't always trust him. And so that was the big thing that I wrestled with when I began to stumble over the idea that God was not in control, certainly not the way I had been taught, and why I started chasing that idea down. And so I would love you to maybe walk us through what that means. Well, let me say this. I've had a whole lot of people reach out, and I believe you have as well, because I've read some of the feedback on the book. People that have reached out that have lost a child, or they've experienced a tragedy or some great evil, and have had this great broken place between them and God, where they couldn't connect with God anymore because good Christians had come and said, there's another angel in heaven, or God allowed this so that, and they would twist the idea of his goodness. And so one of the sweet things is I've had lots of good feedback from people coming into healing with the understanding of the uncontrolling love of God. I'd love for you to kind of speak to that.
Well, I tell you, I get letters almost every week from people who've read either God Can't or one Uncontrolling Love of God, who who've been told those kinds of, I'll just call them unhelpful cliches. They've been told, given these reasons, that God allowed their pain and suffering. And I think when people give those reasons, those people have good motives. They're well-meaning people, but they just don't satisfy me, at least, and they don't satisfy the people who send me these letters. In fact, I've gotten to the place where I've kept track of things that people sent me, and I think let me read one of them to you, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit about how I got to where I'm at.
Awesome.
This is a woman who writes this. I've always heard people speak of God allowing things, and it's never set well in my soul. If God allows one thing, then where do we stop with how much he does allow, good or bad? If God can control, then where do we stop with that idea? I've never been able to accept that God controls or allows, because that would mean that God allowed my childhood torture. He did not exercise control to stop it. Unacceptable. This bad view of God has led me to waft in and out of a crisis of faith. I thought God was controlling, or at least allowing. I had no other way to conceptualize it. And I was told it wasn't okay to ask the hard questions. But the idea that God can't completes what I've not yet been able to articulate. And that's a really common phrase that people who read the book or hear me lecture, they'll come up to me and they'll say, I've kind of been intuiting this idea, but I've not had the words to articulate it until, I read your book or heard you speak. And so much of it has to do with how we think about God's power. And I think it's just natural for lots of people to begin with the idea that God has a certain kind of power. I mean, you think about when Hollywood puts together a movie about God, they call it Bruce Almighty instead of Bruce All-Loving,
Right.
or Bruce Omnipresent.
So good.
That's really good. Yeah.
And so, given that we start with God's power and we think God's got to be the most powerful, which I actually agree with that, we end up giving God the kind of capabilities that make God culpable. In other words, morally responsible for not only causing bad things, but for allowing them, as if God could stop them. And that's what I'm objecting against. And I think there's actually good biblical reasons to object to that standard view of God's power.
Yeah. I really liked a statement I heard you make, that you wrote this book as a means of rethinking God's power as a means of explaining evil. And I thought that was really brilliant in the way that even fits with our podcast, Rethinking God. And, you kind of dealt with that false choice that God is either all controlling or he's sitting on the sidelines. And you did away with that and brought kind of a new perspective into it, which I think is absolutely liberating. I mean, my own experience of having my first wife killed by a drunk driver, 7 months pregnant, a believer, trusted God. And, I heard those kind of things like, well, God allowed this to happen because of X. Or even worse, Derek, maybe you opened the door to allow this to happen because of something that you did. And so your book, How to Believe in a God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Evils, there's so much freedom in it. I want to hand this book to every person I know that's been through any type of trauma.
Oh, I'm happy to hear you say that. I mean, that's really the reason I wrote the book. Is I had written this book called The Uncontrolling Love of God several years earlier, and it kind of has the kernel of this idea, and God can't, but it's written more for an academic audience. And several people came to me and said, I really want a book I can give my grandma.
Or me.
Yeah, that's right. And there were some other ideas that I hadn't put in The Uncontrolling Love of God that I wanted to add in a new book, the God Can't book. So that's really why I wrote it, not just to give what I think is a solution to the problem of evil, but also pastorally to spread these ideas in ways that people can understand.
I love that. My personal journey was one, when I got to that book, for me, God is love is the foundation of everything. Jesus' perfect theology was the invitation into that. And so when I began to run down this idea, I'd written a book previously called Prone to Love. And in that book, I had a chapter called God is Not in Control, in which half of my friends said they'd divorce me if it stayed that way. And so I realized, actually, it was helpful. I realized this probably wasn't the time to go down that road. But it did fascinate me how much pushback I got, especially when I left the chapter exactly the same, but it only changed, instead of saying God is not in control, I said he's not controlling. And suddenly they were fine with all my conclusions, which was fascinating to me and led me down that trail of writing God is not in control. What I realized I was writing about as a storyteller, as a guy who thinks relationally, I was writing about the nature of love. And I was writing about the fact, particularly the sovereignty of God in the context of love. So I would say it to the people this way, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I'd say I'm not writing about the idea of control being wrong. I'm writing about the context of relationship. And in the context of relationship, you can say, for instance, Jason is in control of his car. That's a great thing. But if you say Jason's in control of his wife, or Jason's in control of his kids, or Jason's it doesn't work in the context of relationship, because love doesn't work that way. Love requires sacrificial laying of yourself down to one another. Anyone who's in a controlling relationship, in a relationship that undermines trust and cuts you off from access to intimacy. But what I then had to navigate was, well, how do I get after this biblically? I want to read just a quote to you, and then you, wherever it takes, but you wrote, I'm not the first theologian to say love comes first in God's nature, although this view is in the minority, which I chuckle when I read that, because it's hard for me to fathom. But nor am I the first to say God must love, although this strikes many people as unusual. I don't know anyone else, however, who adds the particular content I do when saying love comes first in God's nature. This was, of course, for me, that is the foundation of all things. You go on and it says, it's this content I call essential kenosis, or uncontrolling love theology. Then you go on to talk about how you interpret the Bible using essential kenosis. I would love for you to talk about that right there, that uncontrolling theology, or uncontrolling love theology.
Yeah, biblically, I had become convinced that the themes of love were central in Scripture. I thought they were central in Jesus, as we've already mentioned. I thought they were even prominent in the Old Testament, even though I wanted to be very fair to say that there are some passages in the Old Testament that portray God in unloving ways. I don't want to sugarcoat those and pretend they're not there.
Right.
But as I look at what John Wesley would say, the whole tenor and scope of Scripture, the themes of love were dominant for me. Yeah. But what came as a surprise was when I realized that the idea that God single-handedly brings about events in the world is not an idea I can find anywhere in the Bible. I had assumed that, like when I would read miracle stories, or God hardening Pharaoh's heart, or when I read Genesis or Revelation, I just kind of assumed that, well, God usually gives free will and usually acts in a relational way, but every once in a while, God single-handedly brings about results. But the Bible never explicitly says that. And that gave me more courage to think that this uncontrolling love perspective had more biblical support than I had even imagined when I first began thinking about it. And little things that I probably read many times before in my life in the Bible, but now took on new meaning in light of an uncontrolling perspective. So, for instance, many times when Jesus does miracles, he talks about the faith of those who he healed. And as a kid, that was used as kind of a bully, a big stick to say, if you're not healed, you didn't have enough faith. But I realized that there's another way to think of that, and that is that we do need to cooperate with God, and that Jesus works with the faith of those who are involved to bring about the kind of healing. Sometimes people can have plenty of faith, and yet their bodies not cooperate. So just because you have cognitively or saying yes to God doesn't necessarily mean the outcomes are going to be there. But my point is, over and over, things began to pop up in Scripture that if they didn't confirm my view, at least they gave a little evidence, more evidence for it. Another good one, when Jesus goes to his hometown, he can't do miracles there. These kinds of things point to some kind of necessary agency or cooperation on the part of creation in the kind of activity God wants to do in the world.
Yeah, that's so good. I actually pulled a statement from another podcast you were on recently, and you said this. You said, an always active, always loving God simply can't get the kinds of things done in terms of love in the world without us. And you said God's plan for the world requires our cooperation. And then the conclusion you came to was, which means our lives really matter.
Yeah.
And of course, I think some of the pushback that we get, as a pastor, when you frame God as love, I think people instinctively they know what a good father should be like, but their own father experience usually clouds that, and they'll see God as either the absent father or the punishing father. Or I think you outlined some other, colorful language in your book about the wall and the brick wall and the other views of God that distort. But the pushback sometimes I think we get when we make a bold statement that God is love is always, well, but he's also holy. God is love, well, but he's also just. And my question would be, well, okay, well then can you show me an unloving holiness?
Right.
Because that sounds like a Pharisee. And to just try and bringing people into this cooperation with love to see our world change, to see people's lives changed. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where real transformation happens, is when people are introduced to something they instinctively know, and that is what a good father really should be. For me personally, my daughter broke her arm 3 times in a short span.
Wow.
And, first time she came rollerblading back with the bent up arm.
Oh.
She said, I looked at it and I was like, oh my gosh, if it's
right.
at all possible, I would gladly take this off of you so you don't have to suffer with this. And that's the heart of the Father.
Yeah.
So how do you bring people into this cooperation mindset in working with God instead of he's in control and I just don't have enough faith? Or how do you bring people into that mindset of cooperation?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting psychologically when I talk about these issues, especially with a live audience. When I talk about how God really needs our cooperation in order for love to win, I can see some people in the audience, their shoulders kind of go back and their heads kind of lift, and they're like, yeah, finally a theology that fits what I've been thinking all along, that my life matters, my choices make a difference. But then there are other people who you can almost see their shoulders slump a little bit.
Right, yeah.
And they're like, oh, you mean what I do matters? Like, this sucks. I was hoping that God would just snap the fingers and boom, everything would be fine without me doing a single thing. And so I suspect to those latter people, I say, yes, your life really does matter, but the whole world isn't on your shoulders. God's just calling you to do your part. Your part really matters, but don't think that everything's going to hell in a handbasket because you maybe failed here or there. But this view that God is a God of love who requires our cooperation overcomes all kinds of other problems in terms of how we think about what happens in our lives in the world, because we often realize that we have, what would be the right word? We have some kind of role to play, and we are blameworthy or praiseworthy depending on whether or not we cooperate with that role. So you're talking about being a good father. You know that there are things you can do that would be unloving as a father. So you have a role to play in the nurturing of your daughter. But you could do it poorly and therefore be blameworthy. that just fits perfectly with the notion of a God who doesn't control us, who calls upon us to play a role in what happens in the world.
Good.
Wow. One other thing I noticed in your book, which I thought was expressly in the realm of healing. In the 3rd chapter, you are talking about myths and realities, and you went through a long list of, say, God healed long ago, but he doesn't heal any longer as a myth. And the reality is that God always works to heal. This was true in the past, and it's true in the present. As I was reading all of those myths and realities, I almost got the essence of Jesus when he said, "Hey, you have heard it said, but I say. You have heard it said, but I say." That was brilliant. I loved how you did that. I mean, for me, that's the kind of digestible sermon series that you can teach people and disciple people in. Like, hey, here's a myth we've been believing, but here's the reality. I really thought that was very helpful in the book. But how would you say tackling some of these bigger myths? Not just in the realm of healing, and bringing the reality to it about who God is. I mean, you do a wonderful job in your book, but maybe in that conversation with someone who's pushing back or they're doubtful, how do you engage with that person in order to bring them to the truth of the reality?
Yeah, it obviously depends on the situation and
Right.
the context of what the subject is, but generally speaking, the theology that I'm proposing here fits with the way we live our lives. I think this is an important feature in any good theology. Sometimes again, I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, which is sometimes called the holiness tradition. And it was a part of our history to believe that people could be perfect in this life. And so we preached Christian perfection. Now, exactly what that meant varied, and
Sure.
people still argue about that. But I never saw anyone who was perfect. I thought to myself, hold on a second. Do we have a theology that can actually be lived? Is it actually livable?
Right.
So take another instance. Take prayer. A lot of theologies have said that God not only predestines what's going to happen, but God foreknows with certainty everything that's going to happen from the foundation of the world. Well, does that make sense in terms of our petitionary prayer? When we pray and ask God to work in healing power in Aunt Mabel's lungs, as if God actually might respond and do something different, does that fit with the notion that God has already pre-decided everything? It doesn't.
No.
So I think we need a theology that actually fits the way we live our lives. And this uncontrolling love theology is my attempt to try to do that.
Grateful for you, man. Thankful that we're having some time with you here. I'll read something you've got a couple sections. You talk about free will. God squeezes good from bad. It reminded me of He works all things for good. I actually love. I love to teach on that. I think, like you, I find that some people are like, yeah. Yes, he's when you begin to reveal the sovereignty of His love, the goodness of God. There's so many in the room that are excited, and there's also a handful that seem to get pretty uptight about it, pretty concerned about it as well.
Yeah.
And the idea that God works good things out of bad, and then that God needs our cooperation. These two themes are pretty large in the book, but to me they go really hand in hand.
Yep.
And for me, foundationally, it's a foundation that God is good. He's always good. That's the starting place. And then from there, how do I partner with Him? I just helped somebody write a book. As I said, I'm a writer by trade, and so I'll help people write their memoirs. And this particular person is an athlete, and a pretty elite athlete. And when I was asked for the byline, or by the publisher, I was asked, could you describe this book in one sentence? I said, yes. It's this, from the athlete's perspective. God is good and God is faithful, and I've worked my ass off to prove it. And I would love for you to speak about when you discover your free will foundationally in the goodness of God, then what does that partnership look like as you live it out?
Yeah, I think almost all of us believe we have free will. Some people have a certain belief in God of being sovereign, that they think that even though they believe they're free, God is actually in control. So they're, in philosophy,
Right.
we call these people compatibilists. But even they think they are free in some sense, at least from time to time, or they think their kids are free to disobey when they're disobeying.
Right.
So they think
Right.
they'll be free. I think we need to be clear, though, that being free doesn't mean free to do absolutely anything. Sometimes people in our tradition who believe in free will make these grand claims that sounds as if we're free to be the next president of the United States if we really
Right.
just want to. I think we have genuine freedom, but it's limited. It's limited by our background, our genetics, our social location, our past choices, our future possibilities. But amongst those limits, we have real freedom to choose in the moment, depending on what's possible.
Mm.
And this not only means that our lives matter, but it also helps with the evil issues. But I make even a wilder kind of claim that I'll throw out to you guys. I think that humans may be the only ones with robust freedom, but I'm open to the possibility that other creatures have a measure of freedom. And I'm open to the possibility that even smaller creatures have some kind of agency, even if we might not call it free will. And even at the smallest levels of reality, there's self-determination or indeterminacy at the quantum level. And these ideas are important to me because they also help to make sense of what we sometimes call natural evils, or
Say that again.
Natural evils.
Okay.
Like, maybe an earthquake that kills a bunch of people, or a hurricane that comes through, or diseases like right now we have a pandemic going on. I don't think anybody freely chose to spread this pandemic around the world. So if God is a God of love, why would God up and stop it? Well, if you think that humans are the only ones that have any kind of agency in relation to God, then you'd have to maybe come to the conclusion that God is allowing or wanting this virus, and I don't believe that's the case. So my theory says that there is agency even at the smallest levels. And because God is a God of love, God gives that agency even to the viruses, such that God can't control at that level. And that allows me then to not only give an answer to why God doesn't stop someone torturing someone else, but also why God doesn't prevent things like miscarriages or cancer or volcanic eruptions that kill people. That's taking this free will, as we started on talking about, and really applying it throughout all of reality, but talking about it in matters of degree, and saying that at the smallest level, it might not be full-blown free will, but even there's some kind of responsiveness to God that God can't control.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
I'm just I'm reminded of the hermeneutic that Jesus gave us when he said, "The thief, it comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." That to me became this new thought that he introduced as to the existence of evil and the choices that evil is making, and put it in the context of what you just said. Wow, that really makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
That verse that you mentioned is one of the verses that's been a touchstone for my life. That's
same.
It became for me important. I think it was either college or high school, and I began to realize that a relationship with a loving God isn't primarily oriented around rules and obeying things, but about living a good life. And I wanted to be a follower of Jesus because I thought it was really the best life to live, not just because, God was going to kick my butt if I lied or masturbated again or something like that. That was a turning point. That abundant life stuff is so important.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's I think why we call it the good news.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Thomas, this has really, really been insightful. I believe that I believe your book is going to really open a lot of eyes to the real goodness of God and the truth of his character. And it's so well written. I mean, it is definitely going to reach a very broad audience. I'm recommending it to everybody I know of. And just that we can trust the God of uncontrolling love. It's such a beautiful thought.
Oh, thanks so much, guys. I enjoyed talking about this. And of course, as I said, it means so much to me to hear that people are catching these ideas, and these ideas are so helpful. So thanks so much.
Yeah, I before we let you go, there's a couple, we're rethinking God with tacos. And partly just didn't want to take ourselves too seriously, but mostly we love tacos.
It's true. This is true.
I'm a big taco fan myself.
Well, I had a feeling. I mean, you're a human being, so do you have a particular taco story, a particular favorite?
Yeah, there's actually a place in Nampa, Idaho, where I live. It's the taco bus. It's Lupita's Tacos, and it's a stationary bus. A woman who's in her 70s, who cooks really great tacos and quesadillas, and and of course she speaks broken English, and I have to try to use my Spanish on her when I go there. But
that makes the taco taste better.
It's true.
Unbelievable tacos.
Well, we both want to go to the taco bus with you, Thomas. Hey, one other quick thing. I was scanning your Instagram. You're quite a photographer. Was that your photo of the Oregon coast? Yeah,
it was. Yeah, photography is one of the ways I try to express myself artistically. I try to get outdoors and hike. I do a lot of hiking and backpacking, and so
Well, that was some Ansel Adams level stuff right there.
Thank you.
We want to let people know where they can find you, but one of the questions that sometimes I like to ask is, if we were having coffee right now, what would be the thing that is burning in you that you were like, man, I've got to, basically, what's your next book? What's the thing you got to tell people?
I'm in the middle of three books right now. One is I'm not really in the middle of. It's been sitting in a file for a couple of years, and I don't want to finish it. But the other two, I have a book on love that I want to write. Whenever I say that, and my wife hears me, she says, "Another book on love." But
that's the only thing I ever preach.
That's the only thing I've ever written.
I have one message, and it just all comes out in different ways.
That's exactly it.
And the other book is I'm an open and relational theologian, and I direct the Center for Open and Relational Theology, and I'm writing a book that's written for the person on the street to introduce what open relational theology is and some of the diverse forms of that kind of thinking. So
that term relational theologian, I heard it a few years back from a guy by the name of Graham Cook. It was just in passing. I don't know if you know him, but
no, I don't.
But I'd heard the phrase, and I went, "That's it. That's what I am all this time." I didn't know how to explain it because, of course, I'm a theologian, and I'm just not wired. I'm an artist. That's how I'm wired.
Yeah.
Could you just break down for a minute? Because to me, when you just said, I'm like, man, I didn't even know that was a thing. I just heard the phrase and grabbed a hold of it. And a relational open theologian, is that what you just said?
That's right, yeah.
Walk me through that. I'm fascinated.
The word relational stands mostly for the idea that God is relational.
Yeah.
Most Christian theologians, Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, etc., they thought God was unaffected by the world. That's not the God described in the Bible. It's not this God most people think of. A relational God thinks that we have an effect upon God, and God has an effect upon us. There's a kind of giving and receiving.
Yeah.
The openness part's a little more controversial. It says that God faces an open future, such that even God doesn't know with absolute certainty everything that's going to happen. So God can make predictions and guesses, but the future is open. and therefore God moves toward the future with us in a relationship.
Okay.
Wow.
That's pretty fascinating.
You know, when you said that, I kind of felt like, I think Jesus is a relational theologian.
Yeah.
I think so.
I'm pretty sure he was a relational theologian.
That's such a beautiful thing. That's such a high value for God and for humanity. I mean, I'm very thankful for that. And I'm very thankful for you and for people that are running this thing down in ways that are both academic and also practical that we can get a hold of, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. It resonates deeply, and we really appreciate your voice.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation, and I invite both of you and your listeners to, if they want to find out more, just Google Center for Open and Relational Theology. And thanks also for the opportunity to spread the word about God can't and how it might be helpful for people.
Hey, how do people find you on Twitter or Instagram?
Well, Twitter is my full name, Thomas Jay Oord, and my last name is spelled O-O-R-D. I have a website with also my full name. Instagram the same way, Facebook the same way. I've got such an unusual name, it's easier for me. So, Thomas J-J-A-Y Oord, O-O-R-D.
Awesome.
In our conversation, I got the sense that maybe you guys don't know about the questions and answers for God Can't book. Basically, I got so many questions from God Can't about things like prayer and miracles and how God acts and eschatology that I wrote a book that took 8 of the biggest questions, and I give a chapter to each of them. And so I'll send you guys a copy of that.
Just so you know, that will become an 8-week series titled God Can't. And I will address each of those every week. Thank you. I will give you credit.
The first time.
Yeah, no, I got it.
I love it. Great.
Awesome.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks.
Bless you, man.
Bless you, man.
Yeah, you guys too. See you later.
Hey guys, we're so glad that you are joining us for season 2 of Rethinking God with Tacos. You can find me, Derek Turner, at rivercharlotte.com. That's my church. And I'm on all the social medias as Pastor Derek T, D-E-R-E-K, Pastor Derek T.
Yeah, and he's a Twitter savant. You got to follow him on Twitter. I would like all of your stuff, but I don't want you to think that I'm
a troll.
A troll? No. No. I don't want you to think I'm stalking you.
Fanboy.
I'm a fanboy, absolutely. I am. You're really good at it, man. I'm also on Twitter at Jason Clark Is, and you can find all of these podcasts, including season 1, on all of the platforms, Apple, Spotify,
all the places. You can also go to afamilystory.org, and everything's there. If you sign up for our mailing list, we send out a weekly email that has articles, podcast information, and we also let you know about new books coming out or events that we're connected to. So like, share, retweet, and man, if you could write a review, it actually does something for the rankings. It makes it more available. So, but a 5-star review, of course.
Yes.
You know, if you can't write a 5-star review or something, like, just don't even write a review.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. It's kind of like, if you can't say something nice,
don't say anything
at all.
I like that, and then apply that to this podcast. Definitely.
That's my motto. That's what I do.
I love it. So love you guys. Appreciate you coming on the ride with us. God bless.